John, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Of course. So, medieval mindset is the name of your channel.
Mhm.
What was the medieval mindset?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. The word medieval obviously conjures something in people's minds. I think a lot of that comes from Hollywood or bad popular history about mud and peasants and, everybody's a slave and, everything's backwards. Also, I don't know if a lot of people realize that medieval covers roughly 1,000 years of history. And when we say medieval, it can't really sum up one place or like mindset or thing. So my channel's a little bit general, but I think overall some consistency we can find, at least in the Western European mindset, which is primarily what I address, is a sense of even though the universe, especially the medieval universe and the world is so chaotic, so violent, so unpredictable, so many causes and effects that aren't understood in the scientific way that we know now, there's the sense of an ordered universe, the sense of an ordered society, the sense that you as an individual have your role to play, the open mindedness towards the more mystical aspects of life. And then it's sort of a double-edged sword of, I mean, if you don't necessarily understand the natural forces around you, you kind of start to create or be a little bit more credulous towards what those things could possibly be or what's causing those things, which leads to, I think, almost strangely, a more open-minded view towards the world. They also had a much more communal life. The historian Barbara Tuchman, who I have issues with for other reasons, but she has some great observations. And she was basically like the medieval man didn't know privacy, at least in the way that we know it now. Everything was totally communal. People pretty much lived on top of each other. I mean, in a house, the entire family would sleep in one bed. If you were traveling across Western Europe on, let's say, a pilgrimage in the late Middle Ages, you stay at an inn, you're sleeping in a bed with 10 people. It's a huge bed. There's just no concept of isolation. And in that way, not as much of a concept of maybe some of like the modern sort of mental health, although, I mean, the medieval mind has its own issues with that as well. And there's interesting treatment for it. But I think the medieval mindset is communal over individual, willingness to accept a degree of mysticism and not having to classify necessarily every single thing, and a sense of order even in the midst of disorder, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the privacy point is really interesting. I think one thing that a lot of people might do a double take on when they were reading Chaucer's Miller's Tale, not the Miller's Tale, the Reeve's Tale about the Miller, when they're reading Chaucer's Reeve's Tale, is that the all the chaos that happens in their bedroom, there's three beds. I mean, technically four if you count the baby. There's the bed that the guests are staying in. There's the bed that the daughter is staying in, and then there's the bed that the parents are staying in, and then there's the cradle. So all of the chaos when, the two boys go and engage in explicit intercourse with two separate women in the same room, and
Mhm.
like no one really even notices,
Yeah.
which is a bit hard to picture. Not that I'm trying very hard, but like that is very odd that they are all in the same room, and none of them seem to be sort of afraid of doing those kinds of things with other people in the room, which is, that's a bit shocking.
Shockingly, there's not as much of a modern sense of shame. And you would think there would be, especially because it's a much more devoutly religious society. And I think we kind of associate that with like puritanical Christianity, but the Puritans, that was not really a thing yet. And essentially it's a little bit more, I don't like not free love, but it's in village life. Catholicism was almost like a trickle down effect socially. And at the village level, I mean, up until the late Middle Ages, like there weren't even priests doing formal sacraments of marriage. It was kind of like a handshake deal. So a lot of things weren't formalized in the way that we think they are. And just because something was true for nobles and kings doesn't mean it was necessarily true for peasants. And maybe you've encountered this as well, but so much medieval humor is sexual. Like even the what we see in the Canterbury Tales, very sexual, very scatological, a lot of fart and poop jokes in medieval humor. So that's another misconception about the medieval mindset. I think people think of them as very dour and serious people, and in their dirty clothes and their missing teeth. But they were actually quite jolly. There was a lot of color to medieval language and to medieval storytelling and medieval clothing, which I don't think is often represented in pop culture. But yeah, it's an interesting idea. I wonder also if with the biphasic sleep, which was common in the Middle Ages, where you sleep for 4 hours, you're up for like 2 hours in the middle of the night, then you sleep for another 4 hours, which apparently was common kind of everywhere before the Industrial Revolution. If that means that your 4 hour chunks, you're in like a much deeper, if you hit deep sleep, maybe I'm overthinking this, but it's like you're so out because you know you only have 4 hours till you have to get up to pray, at midnight. I don't know, but who knows?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing you mentioned the free love sort of phrase. I've only, and do tell me if you found another one, but in all of my reading of medieval literature and church literature, I've only ever seen one instance of the sort of everyone should dress more chastely, which is seems to be so common in modern Christianity. The idea of like, oh, everyone's dressing immodestly, and I've only seen that once in all of medieval literature, and it was a priest saying that men are wearing their tights too tight and that everyone can see too much,
Yes, yeah, yeah. They can
which
see
is
they can see the butt and the bulge. Yeah, that was I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. It's interesting. There is quite a lot of that, but it almost all comes from the clergy. And you
Mhm.
wonder how much of that is like old man shaking fist at cloud, and how much of that was really taken into consideration by the common people, especially because a lot of it was impractical. Again, in a society where you're living with no privacy, like how much of this can really be enforced and how much of it just becomes a common understanding of like, you're going to see some things, you're going to experience some things, and that's just kind of rural village life. Um, but yeah, I mean, throughout the Middle Ages, especially in the late Middle Ages, there's sort of this among lay people. So the church obviously has always kind of had its own strict rules and observances. And it isn't until the late Middle Ages when literacy, even pre printing press, kind of starts to trickle down a little bit. You see more of the common man being able to read, and you see books of the hours being mass produced, and thing like a guide you can take with you to mass to understand the liturgy better because you don't really speak Latin, those sorts of things. There's a more of an emphasis on private devotion, which actually was like a big springboard for the Reformation, because before that it was totally communal. It was all about corporal faith, and then you get kind of more of an interest in private devotion, and then you start to see more of a push from your average person towards chastity, because all of a sudden monks are like the monastic lifestyle is something people are striving towards more in their common life. But even then, yeah, it's something that clergy will write tracts about, and but it's like other clergy reading it. They're rallying
Mhm.
against the improprieties of their time and the fashions, the pointy shoes. That was another big one. The very long pointy shoes that have to be tied to your shins because they're so pointy. Of course, you'll get all of these priests, especially in France, kind of going in on that quite extensively.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you mentioned the average person's desire to live a more monastic life. I think that's another thing that's happening nowadays. I've gotten a couple requests to make videos on the rule of Saint Benedict, which is that's a great idea. I might do it. It's a really interesting text. And but the motivation seems to be that people want to live like that now. People are sort of seeking those rules in their own faith, their own private life, which seems so different than the church that we get in, again, Chaucer. I think it's, Geoffrey Chaucer seems to me to be one of the best sort of Christian artists and of all time, honestly. I mean, he's so good with like his expressing his faith and stuff like that. But he's really not well loved among modern, Christians. And I think I was told a story once by a professor in the Midwest, in the rural Midwest specifically. He said that his students really like the Knight's Tale. Every Chaucer course, they starts on the Knight's Tale. They love the Knight's Tale. It's about, cosmology and stuff like that, and high love, noble affairs, stuff like that. And then they get to the Miller's Tale, and they raise their eyebrows. And then they get to the Reeve's Tale, and he's had people just walk out of class, just
Mm,
get up and leave. It's
yeah,
Chaucer.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting too. Unless I'm mixing him up with somebody else, which I don't think I am. I believe Chaucer, on his deathbed or close to his deathbed, recanted all of his non-Christian, like anything he wrote that wasn't explicitly religious, including the Canterbury Tales. He kind
Yeah.
of was like, "I regret writing that," which I think tells us something about. I don't know. I've read different scholars discussing that point, and as a criticism of Christianity and of the late medieval Christian mind, like look at what this, look at the anxiety and neuroticism it caused to Geoffrey Chaucer on his deathbed. He's disavowing his masterpiece, but I think it says something more about the medieval understanding of the afterlife, and especially as you get towards the close of the Middle Ages, how much that loomed in the mind of the medieval Catholic. And to me, that's more of a man on his deathbed trying to, dot his I's and cross his T's, as opposed to he actually he didn't think his works were Christian enough. I don't know how much we can, using a modern mindset, really conclude things
Mhm.
about the personalities of like, especially famous medieval figures. But yeah, Chaucer's very interesting. He was also privy to a lot of, like, he just always seems to be in the right place at the right time. Like he's on a ship with an army crossing the channel, and he's talking to a famous English nobleman, and then he's in France and he's well liked there, and the court authors know him, like the other writers, the French writers, because he speaks French as well. And then it's always fascinating to me. I mean, reading any kind of history, but you're reading, and then all of a sudden a name pops up that you recognize, and you're like, he was actually there.
Mhm.
And I think also, I mean, something I talk about, you have Geoffrey Chaucer who's writing more so like literature, I guess we could say, or prose. And then you have someone like
Mhm.
Jean Froissart, who's a French chronicler, which again, there's not so much of an understanding of history. Obviously, now as we know history, you've probably seen a million YouTube videos about how when medieval historians, and I mean like contemporary chroniclers, describe battles, they beef up the numbers to make the battle seem more dramatic or to make it seem like their side. There was only 5,000 English knights and 20,000 French knights, and it's like
Mhm.
logistically that couldn't have been possible. We have archaeological evidence from the battlefield that didn't happen. So you have someone like John Froissart, who writes these like chronicles, but they're commissioned by Charles VI, who's the King of France. So it's like, how unbiased could this chronicle be if it's being paid for and sort of like approved by the King of France? I don't know. It's just interesting to me also reading that you get a different viewpoint in the medieval mind, I think. So you have your Chaucer and you have your Froissart, both of whom are present at a lot of these kind of interesting junctures in late medieval history, especially as we're kind of getting towards the close of the Middle Ages. And it's interesting to see the two sides of the medieval mind there and how they're interpreting these events. I think also, sorry, one more thing about Chaucer is that
Oh, go ahead.
I, some of my videos I do really well, and I don't know what this says about my channel or the internet, but anything I do about medieval women gets a big audience. And I think it's maybe just because not a lot of people talk about them. But if we're looking at the treatment or the role in society of women in late medieval England, Chaucer is like almost always the only example used. And I almost feel like sometimes too much is extrapolated from, especially the Canterbury Tales. Um, and to say like this is the role women had in society, or this is how they were thought of, or I don't know. So I think another kind of interesting point about so much medieval literature is like not all of it can necessarily. I mean, obviously Canterbury Tales is a social commentary, but it's sort of difficult sometimes to work backwards and understand the original intent of some of these authors, especially. I mean, I've said this in so many of my videos, but in some ways they're just like us, and in other ways you would think you were talking to an extraterrestrial. So it's sort of difficult to understand. Um, exactly what's going on in the mind. I was thinking specifically, I was trying to remember the name, the wife of Bath from the
Mhm.
Canterbury Tales. She's like always used as an example of how, the English thought of women. And, she's a little bit duplicitous, and she's kind of, she like sleeps around. Maybe I'm misremembering, but she's the one who's on her like seventh husband, right?
Yeah, fifth
Fifth,
husband.
fifth husband.
Yeah.
And yeah, women were almost always viewed, at least in literature. But again, we can't know if this is really how your average person would have viewed a woman. Your average man would have viewed a woman, but they're always, I almost feel like, pictured as like deceitful and untrustworthy, and they'll pull you away from the Christian path. But again, can we really, just because we have some examples of that, does that mean this is, really what was thought?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The wife of Bath, a lot of people like to take that as a sort of window into female psychology in the Middle Ages and forget that she's being written by a man to say all those
Yes.
things, so it's not
Yes.
it's not necessarily all that reliable. I think it's much more reliable to look at the actual actions of real women and see what they did, uh, and rarely what they said. But I will say, the wife of Bath's tale, in which, for anyone who doesn't know, it's this famous story of a knight. accosts a young girl in the sort of the countryside, which is a really common trope in medieval romances. And then as a sort of punishment, I mean, she goes to the court, reports what he's done, that he has sort of slept with her, and that she has lost her maidenhood, and now she demands, something in return. And King Arthur is very angry and orders him to be executed. But Guinevere, and all the ladies at the court say, no, no, have mercy on him. And so instead, Arthur says, all right, how about this? If you can go and you'll have like 48 hours, I think, and come back and tell us what do what does every woman want in the whole world, then we will spare your life. He goes around, he asks, they all tell him different things. He gets super frustrated and confused, and then finally he meets this like witch, who promises to save his life and tell the court what the one thing that all women want is. And so he brings her to court. She says that the answer is power, power over their husbands specifically.
Hmm.
And then all the Guinevere and all the women in the court say, "Yeah, I bet that's about right." And
Yeah.
then, so his life is spared, but the condition is that now he has to marry the witch. And so, on their marriage bed, he's like crying because she's like an old woman, and she asks him, "Hey, I'll give you a choice. Do you either want me to be young, beautiful, and unfaithful, or I will be old in the way that I am right now, but I will be faithful to you. I'll never cheat on you." And he says, "You know what? Whichever you want." And she says, "Correct, right answer." And then she becomes young, beautiful, and faithful, demonstrating that that is at the end of the day what women want is they want to be given the power to do their own thing. And every time I tell my wife that story, she's like, "Yeah, that sounds about
Yeah,
right."
very progressive. Yeah,
So I
I
think
think it's
it's really interesting. Go ahead, go ahead.
no, no. I was gonna say, in so many of those stories, like you mentioned, there's always the story of the traveling woman or the traveling virgin who's kind of despoiled by a bad actor. And it's
Hmm.
interesting also that the forcible sex itself is not really seen as the moral outrage. It's the fact that her social currency has now been taken away from her, and that has to be made right somehow. Like she's less desirable now as a future bride because she was despoiled by a knight. So that's why he's dragged into court to kind of settle on
Hmm.
this. But also that in so many of these stories, as you would think in a society dominated by men, I don't know, maybe this says something about male psychology, but the husband is sometimes this like bumbling cuckold. That was almost, I mean, especially in late medieval Italy, you see this a lot in some of the late medieval French plays. But cuckoldry was the height of humor. And if you wanted to make somebody the butt of a joke in a play, very obviously to an unlearned audience, have him be very obviously cuckolded, but he doesn't know. He's,
Hmm.
kind of, he still thinks this is his beautiful, faithful wife, and he's buying her roses, but she's, going to the fair with the handsome young squire. I don't know. I don't know what that says about, from male
Yeah.
writers writing this from the male perspective, what that says also, but I don't know.
Chaucer has like four tales at least that have like a theme of cuckoldry, which is
Yeah.
very, as you say, very, not to keep talking about Chaucer, but
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
he's so good. And I think my Chaucerian professor said that the reason behind that, at least this was his guess, and it checks out, is that there are so many relationships where the husband is decades older than
Hmm.
his wife. And so you will get situations where the husband is like 60 years old and his wife is like 17. And in that situation, uh, I mean, when I was 17, I wouldn't want to be married to a 60-year-old, Like at that point, people are going to do whatever they have to do in order to live like an enjoyable life. And there were probably countless situations where, a young woman was sort of running circles around her old husband, which is what the wife of Bath explicitly says that she did, is that she would just abuse her, old husbands because they couldn't really do anything about it because they were like about to die.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
I think it's a fear of, I mean, you can see from so much medieval writing that men do not, I mean, any more than modern writing, men do not understand women at all. And it's sort of an in this like especially with these age gap relationships, it's sort of like this feminine energy in the household that they don't understand and are afraid they can't necessarily control. And then you see that reflected in these, cuckoldry tales or these kind of relationships. But I mean, it happens obviously a lot in real world relationships, especially among the nobility and the royalty, where, an older man, his wife will pass away and he'll, be wedded to the 14-year-old, daughter of a local nobleman. And it's like, so I don't know, especially if the audience for a lot of these written works, as we're moving to the late Middle Ages, is the learned nobility, the literate nobility, maybe they're seeing themselves reflected a little bit there as well, their own relationships.
Hmm. Some of your you mentioned some of your more popular, well received videos are about women. One of them in particular, I think, was had a really interesting premise that like I think the title is "Medieval Women That Weren't Trad Wives."
Mhm.
Obviously, people should just go and watch that video. But for the person who's actively watching this one, could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, it was that actually kind of rose out of anytime I'm sort of doing, I don't know, YouTube's on my mind all the time, and I'm always kind of thinking of video ideas. And I had watched a lecture maybe a year ago that this female professor was giving about how we have this idea of the housewife, the trad wife movement that's become popular on social media in the last 5 or 6 years, where, it's women going back to their traditional roots. They're churning butter in the front yard and they're baking fresh sourdough and they're being very submissive to their husbands. And the understanding, the underlying current of it is that this has always been the historical role of women. And it wasn't until very modern times that that changed. And by trying to change that, we've thrown a wrench in the way that society works. And I think tradwife itself, when people think that, they're thinking more 1950s, 1960s housewife. But anytime I've seen these videos, there is like the undercurrent of like, this is the role of, this is how women have been up until like 1980. And we need to go
Mhm.
back to this lifestyle. And that's it. It's become too overcomplicated. And so I kind of wanted to give this idea that this isn't really necessarily what I was talking about in the video, but the trad wife of the 40s, 50s, 60s is like a very unique time in history that doesn't apply to all women, especially in the United States. But even looking back in the Middle Ages, it's women are very active participants in the household economy. In the late Middle Ages, they're artisans, they're in guilds, they have their own guilds. Some male guilds accept women as members. You get charters of French guilds where women are kind of doing every kind of craft you could possibly imagine. Again, if you think of medieval history at all, you would imagine, the wife at home and she's raising the kids and I don't know, weaving baskets and fixing things around the house or whatever you imagine a medieval woman doing in the house. And the reality is, the household up until recently, kind of everywhere, was the economic unit itself. So the husband isn't waking up in the morning and going somewhere for 8 or 9 hours, commuting somewhere, and then coming home at night. They're working together. So even if you're in the city, you're a burgher and you are, you're a merchant and you sell cloth, you and your wife are in the house, like the bottom floor of the house is the shop, and you live together upstairs. And she's down there with you all day. Maybe she's helping with the financial side of things, and you're running the front of the store, or you're, fixing cloth, and she's running the front of the store. But the household economy kind of all works together. And obviously most of medieval Europe was agrarian. And I mean, the primary reason to have children is that you have contributors now to this economic unit. Once they're 6 or 7 years old, they can come out into the field with you and they can, harvest and sow and all these things. So the wife is contributing to that as well. I mean, we have like medieval stories and even medieval woodcuts of the wife out in the fields with the husband. You see it. I'm not going to be able to remember the name of the manuscript, but it's from about the 11th century in England. It's like an illuminated manuscript, but it has a bunch of, I mentioned in a couple of my videos, it has a bunch of like common pastoral scenes. Like if you were traveling through the English countryside in the year 1100 or in the year like 1050, this is what you would see among the peasantry. And it's men and women carrying, bundles of logs and sticks and, out in the fields and pulling the plow and all these things. So it's just kind of a misconception, I feel like, in history. And that I think that video might be my most watched. That might be my most popular. And of course, in the comment section, it's a lot of people trying to push back against this and say, no, that wasn't the way it was. It attracts a certain type of culture warrior, that sort of video. But I just kind of wanted to point out that, like, even though it was a patriarchal society and women were in a much lesser position than men, it wasn't a rosy time to live as a woman. There were also opportunities, like women contributed. And then also in the video, I'm talking about like convents were kind of independent economic units for women. They brewed their own beer, they baked their own bread. A lot of times they had their own properties that they were collecting rents from. If you were a woman and kind of wanted to be doing your own thing away from men, the church gave opportunities for that. So I don't know, but you know,
Yeah. I think it's really interesting how often you see in the classical and also the medieval age how often you see women who are promise in marriage and then say to their father or someone else, oh, I can't get married. I have sworn a personal vow of chastity forever to Christ. Um, you have to wonder, are any of those decisions influenced by the potential that they're marrying someone that, they don't want to marry, they are looking forward at a life they don't want to live, and their alternative is going to live with a bunch of women forever and basically do cool things like brewing beer and praying and reading cool literature for the rest of your life. Like that's a kind of nice
Sounds
option.
nice.
And I'm sure, I don't want to take anything away from these women because I'm sure most of them were very devout Christians in their life. But, in the same sense that, like, I think there is never a situation where you can actually separate the convenient reasons for doing something with the sort of maybe spiritual reasons for doing something. And I'm sure that the convent was a genuinely very appealing place to be for a lot of women. It was probably very expensive to get there, but once you were there, it was probably pretty great.
Yeah, certainly. No, I mean, and I think also something that's important to remember, I guess if you're looking at it from like a this was a good situation for women type of point of view, you have to remember like any administration of the sacraments still had to come from men. So male priests would have to come visit the convent, or in some of the earlier monasteries, they were co-ed. And there's a lot of interesting kind of stories about, not so holy things that are happening there. But you see, I mean, some of the greatest examples of the late medieval Christian minds are women. You have Saint Catherine of Siena, who's incredibly influential, and even now today is very revered in the Catholic Church. And she has the same thing. She has this mystical union with Christ. She's not going to get married. She decides that from a very, very young age. But she becomes kind of an influential advisor to the Pope. She's very, very outspoken. She actually ends up dying from too much fasting, which happened to quite a few medieval religious figures. They kind of fasted themselves to death accidentally or purposely. It's difficult to say. You also have Marjorie Kemp, who's kind of like this seminal late medieval English Catholic. And you read her works, and she's just like totally. There's this sensual and erotic side of Christianity as well for men and women in the late Middle Ages, but she's totally kind of playing into this role as like the bride of Christ. And, I'm entering into his wounds and I'm drinking of the blood of the Spirit. And you read it and it does sort of have a sensual aspect to it. So I think there's a convenient social reason for it as well. But yeah, you could also look at it as like there were very legitimate spiritual reasons for women to pursue these avenues too, and they took it very seriously.
Yeah, that reminds me of Saint Teresa of Avila, who I guess that's a bit more Renaissance,
Mhm.
but the same concept of I think people have described her relationship with Christ as being like a very erotic one,
Yes.
which is
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
One of
No.
my
Yeah.
favorite, oh, go ahead.
No. No. Sorry. Go.
Well, one of my favorite writers of the Middle Ages is Saint Hildegard von Bingen. I'm
Hmm.
not sure if you've read any of her stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course.
Uh, but yeah, I mean, she's great. One of the, I think, most interesting Catholic philosophers. She actually might be one of the only people in the Middle Ages to mention marijuana.
Hmm.
Um, have you read that passage?
I don't know if I've read that passage specifically. Now I've kind of
It's
just I'm more familiar with her like mysticism.
it's pretty fascinating. She says that it makes the smart person smarter and the dumb person dumber. That it kind of enhances your intellectual capabilities, or no, it sort of what's the word? It magnifies your current intellectual standing. That it sort of makes it more extreme. So you either become much more, intelligent or much more unintelligent.
Yeah, I think she's onto something there. I mean, that also raises the whole question. I did a video on medieval mystics, and I got a lot of like mixed responses in the comments. But it's interesting to see too they're going through these sorts of physical privations. So they're fasting for long periods of time. A lot of times they're in a monastic cell, and they're kind of it's almost like isolation in a prison. Like they're not really talking to anybody. Their meals are being given to them through a hole, and they're going these long periods with no human interaction, no food, and just kind of like reciting psalms over and over again, and they fall into this sort of hypnotic state where they have these physical interactions with Christ or these visions. And then, of course, there's the big question: is that brought on by are you just hypnotizing yourself with the lack of food and the isolation and it's kind of like this mental response to that, or do you need to do these things to open this divine conduit? I think that's something really interesting with Hildegard. And she was such like a polymath. I mean, she kind of did
Mhm.
everything. And I don't remember the name of the artist who reproduced it or the symphony or orchestra that reproduced it, but there's a version of it on Spotify, one of her kind of works. It's like a full album.
Yeah, it's
um,
probably Sequentia.
yeah, Sequentia, that is it. Yeah, with the
Mhm.
blue cover. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I've spoken with Benjamin Bagby, who is one of the co-founders of Sequentia, and in another, not the one with me, but in another interview, he talks about Hildegard, and I think his exact words were, "It might have been the best sounding music in all of human history." Is that she assembled this sort of like Avengers level choir of like the best singers from all over England, the most noble women who already had all this education, and they got there and they just sang all day, every day, like this. I'm like seriously like 6 days a week, like maybe 6 hours a day, just singing, focusing on their pronunciation, getting in the right pitch, making sure their dynamics were perfect. And they did that for decades. I mean, how amazing must that choir have sounded, especially with such a genius at the helm writing all of this like amazing music, which we still have, thankfully.
Yeah, I think that's something. Oops. Just to tie into your earlier question about the medieval mindset, I think that actually like reflects something really interesting, which is something you see even not just among famous figures, but kind of among common medieval people is almost this singleness of purpose, and this kind of simple devotion to a task that I don't know if that's necessarily been lost in the modern world, but I don't think we put as much of an emphasis on it. You see it in Gothic cathedrals, and even in the late Middle Ages, there would be religious guilds that would basically compete with each other to contribute free labor to building cathedrals because it was seen as like this very important communal work. And there's this they're all pitching in for free to build a cathedral that will likely not be finished in their lifetime or potentially even the lifetime of their children. But there's this singleness of purpose. And then even with somebody like Hildegard, you see these outsized personalities that are just on fire for this one specific thing and they're giving their entire life to it, in a way that, again, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist in the modern world. I just feel like it's not as, maybe as popular, something that gets, brought about in pop culture. I mean, Joan of Arc is another famous one, another famous woman, very
Mhm.
single-minded purpose, a very on fire, very outsized personality. So yeah, that's an interesting aspect of the medieval mind as well.
Yeah, it reminds me the Bodleian Library in Oxford. There's a sort of hall connected to the library, which is really famous. I think some Harry Potter scenes were filmed there, and it's one of the. I think it might be the oldest building in Oxford University. The entire campus. It might be the oldest one. It might. I could be wrong here. I think 12th century might be
Hmm.
when it was built, and they wanted it to be like very impressive looking on the inside. They wanted it to have these very impressive looking designs. And so they got the best stone worker in maybe the world at the time, to come in and basically just gave him a blank check, paying him by the hour or like by the day, I think, to work on this. And I think he got about 10 years in, spent like half of the treasury of England and finished like one column.
Hmm.
Like, like
Yeah.
if he had actually, I'm exaggerating obviously, but I think if he had actually finished the entire building, it would have taken him like 200 years to
Yeah.
do like the level of detail. So they actually fired him and got a different guy in to sort of mimic the style, and he got it done quickly. But if you go to that one hall today, there's one column that's just the most beautiful piece of stonework you've ever seen in your entire life. And I mean, I don't know if this guy was just like pulling a prank, but if he wasn't, this is like, I mean, he clearly had no intention of finishing it within his lifetime. He was just going to work at it forever, and then just that was just going to be it for him. So,
Yeah, that's actually, you're bringing up a really, really interesting part of the medieval perspective, worldview, mindset. And C.S. Lewis talks about it in The Discarded Image, which is kind of like his introduction to medieval literature and art. How you should read that first to understand is basically the point of what he's writing, to understand the medieval worldview. And he talks about this extreme attention to detail that you see in medieval architecture. Like you go in a Gothic cathedral and you'll see in one column patterns inside of patterns inside of patterns, this like level of detail and intricacy that we wouldn't really even think of. And then there's also a really interesting book called The Waning of the Middle Ages by Johann Huizinga, which is it's about 100 years old. So the scholarship's a little outdated, but he kind of talks about that this idea of like attention and obsession with detail in the medieval mind is sort of in the late Middle Ages, like causing medieval artistry to collapse in on itself because new ideas aren't being pursued. It's just this obsession with details. He uses I believe it's the Annunciation by Jan van Eyck. But in the background, he paints an entire city. Like it's the background where if you were looking at it on a museum wall, you wouldn't even be, you would need a microscope to see. But every spire is accurate, every bridge, it's incredible, but for no other reason than this obsession with attention to detail. And you can see that also. You mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien earlier, who obviously takes a lot of cues from medieval writers. And a lot of people complain in his books that he goes on for pages and pages and pages with these, environmental descriptions and these, they're walking along the path and there's these trees and this rolling hill and whatever. And you see that also in a lot of medieval literature, these really weirdly detailed like landscape descriptions, and you're like, why are you setting the scene so intently? But to the medieval mind there was no detail too small because the natural world is created by God, so every detail has meaning. And also kind of a unique quirk of the medieval mind that started to go away towards in the Renaissance and maybe even after would be that every abstract idea needs to have a concrete visual representation. I talked about this in a recent video, but an example would be like a concept like the love of Christ. I think like a modern Christian would have no problem just sitting with that abstract concept, like Christ so loved the world, or God so loved the world that he sent his only son. Like we can have that as sort of an abstract concept in our head. But in the Middle Ages, it all needed to be expressed physically in art, which in late medieval Christianity, you see this obsession with like iconography and really intricate tapestries depicting biblical scenes, and especially more intense depictions of Christ's suffering, which wasn't really a thing before that. So now you're seeing the crown of thorns peeling the skin from his head, and he's covered in blood and scourge marks, and you see this expression on his face. Whereas in earlier medieval depictions of Jesus, he's alive. He's like sitting on a throne ruling over the universe, and it's kind of this shift in almost this, I don't know, this obsession with crossing over into like taking another step into piety, this obsession with private devotion and reaching a new level of piety that the common person was kind of striving towards.
Right. It reminds me of the famous complaint of like Thomist philosophy that we had like a choir of monks sitting in a room debating how many angels can fit on the head of a pin.
Mhm.
You have to cross centuries and centuries of philology, not philology, of theology to get to that point. But, it is a bit obsessive, like,
Mhm.
does it actually matter? Like that, why, like, does this level of detail actually get us anywhere? And I think that's maybe prompts the end of the Middle Ages and the Reformation and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, you say in these famous disputations in medieval universities, which are very like structured debates. It's some of the topics are incredible, sort of like that. How many angels can you fit on the head of a pin? These things that you read now and you think to yourself, like, why would this ever have mattered to anybody? Like these theological concepts, but it'll be like a multi-day long debate with a huge
mhm.
crowd. And that's another interesting part of the medieval mindset as well, is that any form of public entertainment, no matter how boring we would think of it now, would draw a huge crowd because there's really nothing else going on. So street preachers held a lot of sway in the late Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much any kind of passion play, which is like acting out the events of, the last section of Jesus's life in the Gospels in public, super, super popular, super influential in the public psyche. So I think that's something that the heard word, as opposed to the written word, was incredibly influential to the medieval mind.
Mhm. Yeah, preaching like politics gets really intense in Chaucer that you get to see these kinds of well, maybe I should say Chaucerian society because I don't think he mentions it very explicitly, but you do get conflicts between like the summoner, the pardoner, the monk, and the priest, right? Who are all kind of competing, maybe the monk less so, but the other three certainly competing for the same sort of like territory. And I think
Hmm.
you even get laws over like who is allowed to preach in what part of town because
Hmm.
otherwise you would get like people stealing crowds from other preachers at the same time and stuff like that. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
it's difficult to, especially as the seeds of the Reformation are starting to be sown, which in and of itself might be a misleading statement, but you see kind of more influence from those street preachers. And especially they always have a prophecy. They always have a prophecy that the new king who was just born will, die in 7 years and a great war will happen. But the prophecies are only written about retroactively. So somebody writing 50
mm.
years later will say, 50 years ago, this hermit was preaching on the streets of Paris, and he said Charles VI would lose his mind, and he lost his mind. So there you go. We should have listened. We should have listened.
Yeah, really. I was recently watching a video of yours which discussed the sort of church experience. Now that we're on the topic of preaching in crowds, uh, I've I'd be really interested if you could just kind of talk about what you think a Sunday was like for like the average, not to be too vague, but the average medieval peasant.
Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of depends. They would either have a small church in their village. It kind of depends like what part of Europe you're in. And then even like if you're in England, like what are you closer to London? Are you farther away from London? Kind of like the central life force of England in the late Middle Ages. So it all depends, but you'd either go to your village church or the nearest village church. You'd gather for mass. That was kind of the center of the day. In terms of what's actually happening at the mass, it's difficult to give one kind of conclusive idea because there are different we can sort of piece together what the experience was like from pretty much like what mass was like prior to Vatican II in the 60s, but also from what people are complaining about in contemporary tracts. And I believe it was in the ninth or 10th century, there's an English monk who's complaining about the fact that the priests are giving the sermons in Latin. He's like, nobody understands Latin. You have to give the sermons in the common tongue. So there's at least some element of a homily being given in the common tongue. At what point in the mass that happens, or if that's happening at every mass in every church in Christendom is difficult to say. But there is a common understanding from your average person of what's going on at mass. And even if you don't speak Latin, if you've been going to mass your entire life, then you're familiar with like this term means this. I generally know what's going on when the priest says this. I think something that would be interesting for us and anybody who hasn't been to like a modern traditional Latin mass is that for most of the mass on a Sunday, you're going to high mass, and I'll give the differentiation in just a second, but that's the main mass at the main altar. Like this is the big show on Sundays, and the priest is not facing you for most of the mass. He's facing away from you. He's performing the sacrifice of the mass, and in the audience, you're usually pursuing your own prayer, your own meditation. By the late Middle Ages, the rosary has become much more fully developed. So it's very common to bring a rosary with you to mass. That's what you're praying. Also, pews weren't really a thing up until the late Middle Ages. It was standing room only, and actually the development of pews in like late medieval English churches, for example, have led scholars to say there was increasing almost like segregation between the haves and the have-nots in late medieval England because the rich would have pews and then the poor would have standing room only behind them. So you'd be standing all mass, and then the rich noblemen, the local, merchants or whatever, they would all be sitting in these few rows of pews at the front. But that's been used to kind of argue that there was a different religion for the learned, like the well-read noble people who had money and sat in these pews, and they were separated from the religion of the common people. And there's a lot of evidence that wasn't the case. But just to go back to what's happening on Sunday, the priest at a certain point holds up the host, and the bells ring, and everybody kind of understands that this is the moment of transubstantiation, that something very, very special is happening. And usually at this point, whatever your most important prayer is, you're saying it like the intention you have that's the most focused, a sickness in your family or some tragedy that recently happened or a tragedy you're trying to avoid, that's when you say that prayer. And there's this kind of belief, especially among late medieval English Catholics, that at that moment your prayer has special sauce. Like you say it right then when you see the host. And it's interesting too, from a modern Catholic perspective, and I just posted a video yesterday talking about this, but that the Eucharist was only taken once a year, and even that wasn't instituted until 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. So nowadays you can take communion every day. Back in the day, in the late Middle Ages, it was once a year, and it was a very serious process. Like that one communion you took, you did one confession and one communion a year, and it was like there was a lot that went into it. But that meant that for your average person, seeing the Eucharist, seeing the host was more important than eating it. Like seeing it was what transferred special properties to you. So that's really when you're at Mass, Sunday Mass in the Middle Ages, what like seeing that host is kind of the center of the whole thing. That's the really important thing. And in the late Middle Ages, you see this blend of superstition and organized religion because people start to think that just seeing the host will commute special. Like if you saw the host that day at Mass, you cannot die that day. Like this is a superstitious belief. Or it was popular for priests to bring the host to a dying person in their house. Like, so they'd walk across the village with the host and they might have a few with them and they might drop one on the ground. And there's stories of like a peasant's walking by and he finds a consecrated host on the ground and he puts it in his pocket, even though he shouldn't. And for the rest of his life, he has good luck because he keeps it on his person at all times. So it's this weird kind of mix of superstition and like actual Catholic theology. And to the church's credit, they really, really tried to kind of transmit this idea that this is not these like magical extra things that are being added at Mass by the common people are not, none of this is actually part of our theology, but it was just kind of integrated into the medieval worldview, this sort of innate mysticism and need for the magic, common magic, it was called. But that's kind of the experience at Mass. And then a lot of people, especially in the late Middle Ages, as individual devotion becomes more interesting, more intense, are going to Mass multiple times a week, and they're going to low Mass, which is usually at a side altar. So if you go to any of these like old medieval churches, there's like the main thoroughfare and the main altar there, like near the front of the church, and then like off to the sides there are like these really small altars. And sometimes even now, if you go, there will be masses being said at those altars. But that's where people are going kind of during the week. So if you have this belief that seeing the host will protect you from evil, you want to see it every day because this is the Middle Ages. Like you could get kicked by a donkey and die today. You could get the plague and die in 24 hours. So you want to cover your bases. So a lot of people are going to Mass, especially in late medieval England, like in the century before the Reformation, even up until the Reformation, daily, at least at the low altars. And then if they're at Mass at a low altar and they hear the bell at the high altar of the host being raised, they'll turn their back on the priest and run to the high altar to see the host being raised. And there are Lollard priests, and Lollardy is like a proto-Protestantism, kind of a late medieval heresy that spread in England. Priests who are like mad about this, that people are so superstitious and they rail against it. And but anyway, so I know I went off on like 5 different tangents there, but that's sort of what's going on. It's a very sacred and holy day, but it's not the only day. I think that's also important to remember that Mass, you would usually be going multiple times a week.
But would you be partaking in the Eucharist every day?
No, no. So the priest would partake in the Eucharist. In the late Middle Ages, like I said, you would do it once a year. You would take communion once a year. But there's evidence of like nobility having their own kind of private priest that they would pay for, and they would take communion more often. Marjorie Kemp, who I mentioned earlier, had her own. She was a woman of means, and she had her own private priest. This is like 15th century England, and it was the subject of much contempt from her neighbors who only got to take the Eucharist once a year. That she was taking it like every week with her private priest, and she could pay for that. It was seen as like a privilege.
hmm Interesting. I think the advantages of living in modern times are probably not even worth discussing. I don't really think there's anyone who seriously would take the opportunity to trade their 21st century life for a 13th century life. That being said, do you think there are things that we were better at back then? I know you've mentioned mental health a couple times in some of your videos. Could you speak to any perhaps advantages over modernity to live in the Middle Ages?
Yeah, I have a video I posted about a month ago called Why You'd Rather Live in 1325 Than 2025. And I think a lot of people just read the title and commented immediately because the point of the video is like, don't want to give up any modern conveniences. But I think it's interesting the Middle Ages and medieval history generally. I feel like it's the only time period I can think of that's just thought of with outright contempt. And I love Monty Python, but I blame Monty Python because I feel like for so many people, the Middle Ages is kind of a joke. You would never want to live back then. Everybody died. Nobody made it to age 5 and all these, I don't know. Or you don't hear that about ancient Rome. I don't know. It's weird. It's this weird like obsession with hatred of medieval history. And even so many like early 20th century influential medieval historians, you're reading their books and you're like, do you hate this is your life's work. And do you hate the Middle Ages and medieval people? You see that in Huizinga, you see that in Barbara Tuchman, a lot of these scholars. But to answer your question, I mean, mental health is an interesting question because it'd be easy to say that, obviously so much of our kind of depression and anxiety epidemic in modern day is from isolation and spending too much time online and all these things, and they wouldn't have had that in these communal societies where there's really no concept of privacy, maybe to an extent, but they definitely did have things like schizophrenia, things that are described and you can't even really put a modern diagnosis on it because you're not even really sure you're getting a full description of what's going on. So, an example that I mentioned earlier was Charles VI, who was the King of France in the late Middle Ages, kind of towards the tail end of the Hundred Years' War, and he basically at a young age loses his mind. He's under a lot of stress. He's riding his horse down the road, and a wild man, jumps out from behind a tree and grabs his horse and is like, "You must stop what you're doing. You must stop the war. You have to stop, you have to repent," and all these things. And for some reason, that moment, he just snaps and he has his first of many seizures. And he has these seizures and then enters into this like almost deluded state where he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know who his wife and kids are. He's swinging his sword at his knights, and he even kills some of his like close personal bodyguards. And this goes on throughout his life. At one point, he thinks he's made of glass. He's running around the royal palace naked, screaming. And during these periods where he's periodically insane, like he can't rule the country. But the medieval monarchy is still so vested in the individual personhood of the king that causes real chaos. And then Henry V comes along, takes advantage of it. England starts to get a leg up in the Hundred Years' War, and then obviously fumbles that at the finish line. But the important thing, even with somebody like Charles, he's a man of the most, he's the King of France. He's a man with the most means for his mental health in, all of the Middle Ages, anyone. And there's really nothing they can do for him. There's different things that are prescribed for it. And if you're a member of the nobility that's suffering from any kind of mental health crisis, maybe they would call it like bouts of madness, or if it was like severe, intense depression, it would be melancholia. First of all, likely has something to do with your humors being imbalanced. So that would be thought of as how to remedy this. But a lot of times, like if you're a noble man or noble woman, and you have an influential parents, and you're not doing well mentally, they would kind of pass you around among family members. Like, okay, you're gonna go stay with your aunt for a year. You're gonna stay with your, this extended family member for a year, and we're gonna shut you up like in the attic. So that was a common way. And then in the late Middle Ages, you see more of like what we would think of as like mental hospitals being set up by the church in major cities, basically to treat people. But again, their attitude toward it is very rudimentary. So I think to answer your original question, what we should bring back about the Middle Ages, I think a sense of wonder, a sense of recognizing the I don't even think it necessarily needs to come from a religious point of view, but kind of recognizing the miracle of daily life. Because in the Middle Ages, you see almost like a childlike wonder, even from like famous medieval figures, which makes sense because most of them were very young. You're reading about somebody and you're like, he really sounds immature, and then you're like, oh, he's 17 and the king. But I think a sense of childlike wonder, a sense of like I was talking about earlier, like having a goal and having single-minded kind of push towards it. And then I think so many Americans, I'll just speak for Americans, we have these mental health crises and these things that are affecting us. And I think we all sort of want village living. We want a community. We want a safety net. We want to know our neighbors. But I don't think a lot of us are willing to make the sacrifices necessary to have village living. Like we want a village, but we don't realize it takes a village. And I think in the Middle Ages, you see a lot more of that. Like you don't exist outside of the group. Like you are you have a role in the group. And also interestingly in medieval documents, sorry for all the tangents, but you'll read about somebody having the option. They get in trouble, some legal trouble, and they have the option of either being executed or exiled from the village. And of course, you're reading this from a modern point of view, and you're like, exiled? Of course, why would I want my head cut off? But you have to remember, like, your village is everything to you. It's your safety net. Everybody there knows you. You grew up there. And if you go knock on the door of another village, they're going to be like, what happened to your safety net? Where is like, you might as well get executed because you've lost your entire kind of center of your universe if you're exiled. It's a very, very bad punishment. So I don't know. I think thinking of our community and our neighbors as an extension of ourselves, and also not looking at our historical ancestors with like a sense of like laughing at them or the silly things they believed in, because in some ways we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's a lot we can learn while not, burning heretics and things like that.
Yeah, I think the exile point is really poignant. I often will, think we have a lot of Roman examples of exiles where they took the option.
Mhm.
Famous ones being Ovid, the poet, Cicero, the rhetorician, and the statesman, and it was like death for them. At least in their writings, it seems to be sort of like they like they in the joke of like it's so over. Like they are like fully in that mindset of like
Hmm.
my life is over. Everything that I've ever worked for is ruined, and they live, but they don't seem to live with a great like desire to live, and so I think it's probably the same in these times as well.
Yeah, yeah. Your purpose comes from community. I think that's an important point. Yeah. That's a big part of medieval life is you don't at least see any examples that spring to mind of anybody looking around and being like, what does this all mean? Why are we here? There's a very
Hmm.
strong sense, even among the common people, of purpose, especially you're living in God's ordered universe. You're put here for a reason. You have a role in this greater communal organism. Like, yes, there are theologians and philosophers that are kind of questioning things, but yeah, I think people understanding that, not to boil it down too simply, but it's not all about you. Like
Hmm.
your neighbors depend on you, and you depend on your neighbors.
How would you characterize the differences between the modern and medieval church?
Oh man, that'll open a whole can of worms. I always have a lot of trad cats in my comment section talking about this exact thing. But the, I mean, the medieval church is much more of a political organism, I think, than the modern church is, and of course, much more politically influential. It's the source of power, especially in the early Middle Ages. It's why Charlemagne goes to Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Empire emperor. And then, of course, by the late Middle Ages, it's too powerful, and so many English kings don't really want anything to do with it. And you see that, of course, kind of forcefully leads to the English Reformation. But I think the biggest difference would be in the posture of the church. I was just thinking about this the other day, but I see someone like Pope Leo, the current pope, and he kind of has this humble, soft-hearted, kind of open-armed public figure vibe to him, and especially in everything he's saying, I feel like he's saying all the right things. He's kind of very careful about how he's coming across from a PR perspective, but he still is like holding the weight of church teaching behind him, and he's taking a stand on certain issues. And I think there's no concept of that in the medieval church. There's no like self-awareness of like how the church is being perceived, because the church is the universe. Um, and it's also what's important to understand is that the church and Catholicism generally in Western Europe is the lens through which you see life. And I think very few modern Catholics, and I know people would argue about this in the comment section, but can really even wrap our heads around that. Like an institution like the church serving as the bedrock for everything, every part of your consciousness. I think it's difficult for us to even fathom. Like it's impossible. But I think the church, the medieval church, and its desire to uphold that status is the single biggest difference. And of course, like I said, the political side of things. The Pope now can't raise an army and has no, he can draft you. There's a lot of things that are, he can't hire mercenaries to do his dirty work in Italy. So
Yeah,
things are different.
yeah. I guess my last question then, if you've got one off the top of your head, is do you think there is a sort of biggest gripe that you have with misconceptions about the Middle Ages?
Yeah, I think, well, there would be two. One would be I'm Catholic myself, and I think there's just kind of the dominant view, at least in American public education, that I learned when I was in middle school, high school, was that the Catholic Church was this evil, corrupt entity in the Middle Ages, and they were just like one villain after another was Pope, and they didn't do anything. Like they basically held society static for 1,000 years and didn't allow any advancement or progress. When, of course, the church was funding education, the church was funding hospitals, the church was funding the revival of classical education. The only reason anybody was literate in the Middle Ages and medieval Europe was because of the church. The only reason like there were any opportunities for independence for women in the Middle Ages was because of the church. They kind of ensured this baseline of fundamental human rights that didn't really exist before they came along. So I don't know. That's one I have a video about that from maybe like 6 months ago, talking about, the good side of the Catholic Church. I think it's important also because the flip side of that is you have the modern trad Caths who are like, everything the church has ever done is right. Like every crusade was right, the Inquisition was right. And if you speak negatively about any of these things, you're like a heretic. And like that's wrong too. So I think my biggest gripe about the perception of the Middle Ages would be a lack of nuance that people have for a 1,000-year period of history. This sort of like Protestant washing of medieval Catholic history and kind of doing away with the richness of Catholic faith and the fullness of Catholic faith and the fact that people understood their faith. That's a big misconception that your average medieval Catholic layperson would go to mass, not understand a word, go home, not understand any of their religion, and just kind of live in this paradigm. And that's not at all true. We have plenty of evidence to suggest otherwise. And I think the big misconception about medieval life was that it was horrible, that everybody was miserable. It was 1,000 years of frowning and sadness. And, it was color and merriment, and life was hard, but life was meaningful. Um, and that our medieval ancestors, in a lot of ways, weren't too different from us. In some ways, they were, but in cultural ways, they were. But in deeply human ways, they had the same motivations we do, and we should think of them that way.
Well, folks, if you've liked what John has had to say today, his channel will be linked in the description and the pinned comment. I'm really grateful for him for coming on the channel and inviting me onto his own Patreon show, which you'll be able to find if you go to his channel and navigate through the Patreon link there. So, John, thanks a ton for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much, and sorry for the horror movie lighting.